Benissimo, allora io comincerei con due parole introduttive, prima in inglese poi in italiano. Good evening, welcome to another appointment on this cycle of international video conferences dedicated to tramways and other means of transport. Tonight's presentation will be given by Alan Murray Rust from England, and will deal about tramways in Portugal, covering the years from 1975 to 2001. This presentation will be done in English. At the end of the evening, there will be a space for any questions, as always, in English or in Italian, and you can also use the chat in English in every moment during the presentation. I remind you that a complete program of the forthcoming presentation and I mean presentation until the month of February 2024. We have already the program done, is available on our internet site in the English section. Thank you. Before giving the floor to Alan, I communicate that the next presentation will be given by myself and will be titled The Renaissance of the Tramways, 1975-2000. So I'm waiting for you on Tuesday, 30th May, 2023. It's another episode of the story of the international story of tramways in the world. Thank you. Now I repeat all in Italian. Buonasera a tutti, benvenuti a un altro appuntamento in questo ciclo di conferenze internazionali dedicati ai trasporti tranviari e non solo. Questa sera abbiamo dall'Inghilterra Alan Murray Rath che ci parlerà dei tram del Portogallo, coprendo una epoca che va dal 1975 al 2001. La presentazione sarà fatta in inglese. Alla fine della serata ci sarà spazio per domande eventuali, sia in inglese sia in italiano, ma potete come sempre usare la chat in ogni momento quando volete. Vi ricordo che il programma completo delle prossime videoconferenze è disponibile sul nostro sito internet. Abbiamo già programmato le prossime presentazioni fino al mese di febbraio 2024. Concludo ricordandovi che la prossima presentazione sarà fatta da me tra 15 giorni, quindi martedì 30 maggio, e sarà intitolata La rinascita del tram dal 1975 al 2000, quindi sarà diciamo la sesta puntata della serie Storia e tecnica tranviaria nel mondo. Grazie, e ora la parola va a Alan. Thank you. The floor now goes to Alan.
Thank you very much, Roberto. Although the presentation will be in spoken English, there are Italian subtitles on a number of pictures where it seemed sensible to have those. And this is the first one. So the presentation, it's a pictorial survey of the 4 tramways that were still operating in Portugal during this period. And there won't be a lot of historical and technical information, and I hope that you'll find that the pictures do speak for themselves. So we start in Porto, and this is a map of the system as I first knew it. It's quite a complicated system of routes, particularly in the city centre where there were different routings. And I'm going to take the presentation through by dealing with sections of route rather than individual services. This was what had happened by 1993. A lot of the network has disappeared. and there was mainly just the coastal service and service along the Avenida de Boa Vista. And we start with the service 7 and 8, which was out to the north of the city centre to Ponte de Pedra. You will see that the Route 8 Paranhos was a very short route and was more or less just a short working of the main route. And there were short workings at São Mamede, from where the trams ran to the Batalha terminus. The main service from Ponte de Pedra ran down into the Praça de Liberdade. The Ponte de Pedra, the stone bridge, which is what you can see on the left, and see old bridge and the newer bridge, and the tram stopped just adjacent to the bridge. Most of the trams running in Porto at the time were Brill semi-convertible type, some built by Brill and some which had been built by the STCP using the basic Brill design. Were built any time between 1909 and 1929, and many of them considerably rebuilt, sometimes with platform doors and logger platforms. So we're going to make our way towards town from Ponte de Pedra. This was the short working at São Mamede, which was a simple crossover in the middle of the street. And here's the tram turning back towards the city. One of the features of the route was this fine stone embankment over which the trams passed. We're moving gradually towards the city centre. This is the Paranhos terminus, as I say, just a short single track stub, only a couple of 100 meters off the main route. And now we're going to move a little bit west to the Monte de Burgos route, the 6, with its short working, the 6 Barre, and this is at the Monte de Burgos terminus. And tram 261 was the last of the Brill style trams to be built in 1929. Larger than the early ones, you can see it's got 8 windows to the saloon, whereas earlier trams had 7, or the very early ones only 6 windows. We're now on the Monte de Burgos route, coming towards town. And next route moving westwards was the short route off the Avenida de Boa Vista to Pereiro. 2 routes, the 3 and the 4, which had slightly different routings into the town. The branch had a large, what they call tennis racket terminal loop, single track with passing loops, or a passing loop. This was the junction with the Avenida de Boa Vista. So now we move on to the main trunk route from Matosinhos into the city centre via the Avenida de Boa Vista, some of which went into the city centre and some went to Batalha, to the east of the city centre. This is the Matosinhos terminus, And here you can see one of the cars that was purchased from Belgium in 1929 and look very different from the Brill cars. But they're on similar maximum traction bogies to the Brill bogie cars. A pair of the Brill bogie cars at the same location looking in the other direction. And now we're coming towards town through Matosinhos with one of the later Brill bogie cars and again one of the larger four-wheel cars. Alongside the sea, next stop United States. And here at the Castello de Queijo is one of the bogie cars which were only used on the coastal lines and the Avenida de Boa Vista. Going round the roundabout at Castello. And here we have a bogie car coming up the Avenida de Boa Vista with the Atlantic in the background. These bogie cars were called fumista because the windows could be completely taken out in the summer, and that allowed smokers to smoke inside the tram. We're now at a short working at Gomes da Costa on the Avenida de Boa Vista. And now on the Avenida de Boa Vista, approaching the big roundabout at the time when the service had been cut short to this, and this had now become the terminus. The depot is on the left-hand side. This was one of the original Brill cars, 129, built in 1909 outside the depot. And at the same location, a car on the 7 to Battaglia. I didn't manage to get any pictures of the Battaglia terminal loop. This was the only picture I have, a car on a section leading towards Battaglia. And as you can see, the main object was the narrow gauge steam locomotive, but you can see the tram crossing the viaduct in the background. This is at Trinidad Station. Of course, the narrow gauge railway has now been converted into the modern light rail system in Portugal, in Porto. The centre for most services was the Praça de Liberdade. And we're going to have a look at the section from Praça de Liberdade down to Massarello. Here we are with the Service 6 car arriving at the Praça. And this section of route is still used by the current historic services. This is one of the smaller four-wheelers with just 7 windows. It does occasionally rain in Portugal. Coming out of the Praça, we go up the Rua de Clérigos, and which is one of the steeper sections of route. And here we have what was the last survivor of the post-war box cars. This is number 373. They were built as single-ended cars, and with the reduction in the network, single-ended cars were not so easy to use. And 373 was, by 1972, the only survivor of the type. We're now coming through Carmo, which was a subsidiary terminus above Praça de Liberdade. You can see by the 1980s, advertising was appearing on the cars. On Restauradores, and this still has tram track although it's now single track on reservation at the side of the road. This is the bottom of the hill, and we'll join the coastal route at the bottom at Martedì. And now we're going to look at the coastal route, the number 1, which ran from Infant and run right through to the Matosinhos. So we're just going to cover the section now from Infant to Castelo de Queijo. The one was run almost entirely with bogie cars. So this is the terminus at Infant. One of the Belgian cars arriving. And a sister vehicle leaving at the same location. This is passing along to the Alfandega or Customs House area and looking down at the same place with the latest trolleybus buses in service. Further along the river, and here is a view with a tram coming down Restauradores, as well as one on the riverside number 1. So a variety of views along the riverside. Trams still run along here, but now the motor traffic runs on a viaduct built out into the river. Here we are at Martedì. So this is on the service 18, and these are the connections into the depot. Here you can see the power station, which is now a museum, with the depot alongside, which is where the historic fleet is now operated from. Belgian car approaching the bridge. There's a Puente de Arabida, and provides some very fine views looking down on the trams. The cement works were a feature at one stage, but have now been completely demolished. Note the traditional men's urinal here, very decorative. All the washing hung out to dry. And people enjoying some leisure and watching the trams go past. Less leisure to watch the trams go past. This is Paseo Alegre, which is where the trams now terminate. But of course, they used to go on from here. And through to Foz. There was a terminal loop at Foz, and here we have one of the four-wheel Fumista cars on that terminal loop. In the heart of Foz, there was a short section of single track before trams reappeared on the esplanade, and you can see the harbour facilities in the far distance at Matosinhos. In 1974, there'd been a wreck that was washed right up against the esplanade, quite dramatic. And we carry on. Here we are at Castelo de Queijo again, a few years later, and there's still part of the wreck which was washed further along. Now have a look at some of the works cars. That is rather a fascinating arrangement where the tram was pushing the rails in front of it rather than pulling them, and you can see that the man on the front is ringing a gong by hand as it goes along. Much of the maintenance work used these former coal cars, which had been built to carry the coal from the mines at São Pedro de Cova to the power station. And when that traffic stopped, they were converted into works cars. And you can see here one being used for just that function, with a nice little trailer on which a welding set is being loaded. This is near Foch. And the final works car view, this was the tar wagon, which has now become part of the museum collection. And the cars in the background here are also the museum collection. So this is a four-wheel motor car and a matching trailer. Also now part of the museum fleet was the car 500, which was built as a prototype for modern cars, but remained the only car of its type because the decision was made to convert much of the system to trolleybus operation. The car was a single-ended car, as you can see. And here we have the situation in 2023 with the 18 from Carmel to Paseo Alegre and the one from Infants to Paseo Alegre with the depot and museum at Masarelos. A line has been opened through from Carmel through to the Battaglia area, but when I looked for any information, it appears it is not in regular service at the moment. So now we move on to Coimbra. This was a system in 1975. A number of tram routes had already been converted to trolleybus operation by this stage, so there were just the three routes. Two of the routes were circular route, effectively circular routes, the 3 and the 4, which did this town centre loop, and then came up to, I think this is Independencia, and then the 3 went up to Sant Antonio and came back down, and the 4 went through this way to Cruz de Celas, and then again back down to complete the circuit. That route had originally been a two-way route, but by this stage was just a one-way route. An interesting feature, doesn't show on the map, is that there was a service 8 that ran the opposite of the 3 routes. So everything went round this loop, and the 8 went round this way to complete the circuit, and had been converted to trolleybus operation. And the 3rd tram route was the 7, which came out the 3 and then ran down to the suburb of Tudim and then came back via the same route as the 3. All the cars were four-wheel cars. Number 1 was one of the original Brill cars, but all the cars were rebodied at some stage between 1957 and 1970, and the original Tramways of Portugal, booked by John Price, does comment that these were one of the nearest things to the American Bernie car that you could find. Is at Portogallo, a nice shot because it includes 4 different forms of public transport: a tram, a trolleybus, a double-deck bus, and an ordinary single-deck motor bus, all following each other. It's just unfortunate there wasn't a train coming along the railway track at the same time. So this is still on the town centre loop. And here we are again. And this is at the just about at the end of the loop. And here we are now on the service 3, climbing up around the circuit under the aqueduct at San Antonio. And here's how I explained things before: the trolleybus and the tram. Just let me go back, that went through rather quickly. But the trolleybus formed the alternative route to the tram, and number 14 was one of the last trams to be built. This shows a junction at San Antonio with a Route 7 car going off the Tovim, and the driver of the Service 3 car here is changing the points, ready to go back down into town. We are now moving down towards Tovim. And at the end of the route, which was a simple stub terminus and turning the trolley. And here coming back at the triangular junction and going down the other route into town. And the Service 3 car at the same point, again, making its way down into town. We've now moved on to the Service 4. And here we are approaching the end of the loop at Cruz de Celas, and the 2 cars were often used together. We've now moved to the old depot at the western end of the town, where there were the last 2 cars to be bought, which were Belgian-built cars, similar to the Porto-Belgian cars, but of course 2-wheel cars rather than bogie cars. And they had been taken out of service following the reduction in the tramway network. A feature of the old depot was the nice traverser in the yard. This depot has now completely disappeared. And towards the end of the tramway operation, all the trams were run out of the Alegria depot, which after trams ceased was converted into a transport museum. So we now move on to the Sintra line. This was a line that was built from the very much holiday town and resort town of Sintra down to the coast at Praia de Massas. It had a very checkered history, and in the 60s and 70s was closed, and then was reopened in 1980 as between Praia de Massas and Banzao. Following the privatization, following its takeover by the National Bus Company, reopening took place from 1995 onwards, with the section from Banzao up to the main depot at Ribeiro. And this was then passed into the hands of the British Stagecoach Group, and the local manager was indeed a Scottish tramway enthusiast, Bob Doherty, who was very much the driving force behind getting the service extended and reopened. And then finally in 2001, the local council of Sintra took over the tramway from Stagecoach. And it was in their ownership that this top section, which I haven't got any pictures here, was reopened. The final stage up to the station where it used to make connection with the railways was not reopened. A decision was made to do that around 2000, so it now terminates just on the edge of the town centre. I've treated this in 3 different visits rather than do the whole thing in one. So we started in 1980 when it was just a section from Banzhal to Praia de Massas. This is at Banzhal, and on the building on the left was the substation, which had a siding into it where the working trams were housed. The route is all side of road reservation. We're running now out towards Praia de Massas. This was one of the original Brill toast track open cars. This was being run as a special TMS party tram, and here is work going on at the Praia terminus. This was Ribeiro in 1980 with cars in a deteriorating condition, and the whole area had got very much the feeling of a farmyard with the various farmyard animals around. 1995, things had got a little bit better, and there were more cars in service. But you can see that cars had got in a worse state, although the depot had been cleared, and work to restore the cars was beginning to get underway. But you can see the very poor condition that some of the cars had got into. 2001, and the service was back up to Ribeira, and this was the Open Car 7, which had been repainted into a yellow livery. This is outside the depot at Ribeira. And some views en route, and number 7 is being driven by the aforementioned Bob Doherty. This is Banzhal again, so you can see the substation here with the siding into it. Again, this was a special party. Is crossing the main road on the way down or way back up from Praia de Massas. The man with the red flag still required to stop traffic while the tram passed. Again, down at Praça with one of the older enclosed cars in a different livery. And now we have one of the cars that was bought from Lisbon for the improved service. The Depot Ribera had 2 floors, and essentially at this stage only the lower floor, which had been the power station part, was in use and served as the workshop and substation area.
Yeah.
So that brings us to the end of part 1. I think somehow the timing of the automatic timing on the slides have got a little bit faster than it should have been. They went through rather than I anticipated, but they were on an automatic timing. Let me catch up with some comments. So I have a question from Andrew Ludassi, who asked what happened to Bob Doherty. Honestly, I don't know what has happened to Bob. He's not somebody that I've had had contact with since Sintra. Right. So let's move on to the next part. And part 2, we'll look at trams in Lisbon. This is the Lisbon system as it was around 1975. A lot of the system had already been withdrawn because of the creation of the metro system, but even so, in 1975, it was a substantial system and very complex in terms of the route network. This is the main city centre, parts of which are quite hilly, and then you can see that takes up this area on the other screen with the long coastal route out to Estadio in the east and the extension out to Poço de Bispo, in the west, and Poço de Bispo in the east. As with the coverage of the Porto system, I'm going to treat it section by section rather than by individual routes. So the first section will cover the routes used by the bogie cars and the trailer sets. So this is primarily the coastal route, and then alongside it the route to Alcantara and the routes up the centre of the city to Arco dos Cegos and Alto de São João. We're going to the reason that the bogie cars were restricted to these routes was that there were no really steep hills or particularly narrow streets on them. The bogie cars were not considered suitable for the heavily graded route. We'll start by covering the whole of the coastal route in its 2 sections. And we'll then come back to Alcantara and go up to Arco de Cegos. This is the Estadio terminus. Only a small number of journeys ran through to here. And the main terminus was Cruz Quebrada, where the trams just use this crossover on the double track to turn back, at least in the 1970s. By 1983, the tracks to Estadio had been taken up, and the terminus at Cruz Quebrada was just a simple terminal stub at the end of the double track. One of the things you'll notice again by 1983 was trams appearing in advertising livery rather than the standard yellow. We're now moving back towards the centre of Lisbon. Here we are at Da Fundo. And again near Da Fundo. And this is our first view of one of the original Brill cars of 1906, still with its original clear story or lantern roof body, maximum traction Brill trucks. These cars did get significantly rebuilt over the years, but a number of them did retain the original Brill style roof. This is the short working at Algés, which is now the terminus of the coastal route. So you can see a car showing service 15 terminating here. And these are the two later series of cars. 809 is one of the set of cars built in 1938-39. They were intended to be built on M&T Maley and Taunton trucks purchased from Britain, but due to the war, the trucks did not become available in time, and 5 of the cars, like this one, were put onto older Brill trucks from withdrawn trams. The post-war cars of 1947 were built with this box-like body, and again, half of them received the Maley and Taunton trucks, which had originally been intended for the 800 series, and others again on older trucks. We're now moving again along the coastal route towards the centre of town, still in Algés. And we come to Belém with the fine Clérigos monastery, and that picture and this one show the Stevenson built cars, which had equal wheel trucks and were intended for express routes. And you can see the later rebuilds with either dome grooves or slightly different, again without the clerestory roofs. This is a Brill car on the left and a Stevenson car on the right. Again, this is outside the Mosterio de Jerónimos, where there was a short working, and this was the terminus actually of the 17. And here we can see a trailer set comprising a post-war 2-axle car with an equivalent post-war 2-axle trailer. Note that the trailers were much smaller and lower in height than the motor cars. Coming off the terminus circle is now one of the modern cars in very early period of their use. And leaving the circle, again, one of the unrebuilt Brill cars, and you can see the maximum traction trucks in the sun. Again, making our way towards town. Santa Amaro, the depot is just beyond the tram. Again, one of the new articulated cars outside the depot. A fine set, looking down a fine set of steps at Rocha with the port in the background. And we've now come to the junction at Santos. You can see it's quite a complex junction layout. The interesting thing is that in the 1970s, there were still services using all the different curves at the junction. The only one that was not in regular passenger use was the little siding. So we have a car here on the 17, which is going on to the slightly inland section of route. We're now at Caixa, which was a terminal point for other services, but again, we have a 17 running through, and here we have a 15 crossing and going out towards Belém. And this is the terminus of the 15 in Praça do Comércio, but we'll carry on through. Here's one of the modern cars again. Past the Lisbon Alfândega Customs House area, the old town in the background. This is the railway station on the right. And this was the terminus of the Route 3, Caminhos de Ferro, near the station. And here we had an interesting three-track layout. So the number 3 cars would come along here, cross over the inbound track to a stub, and they could then pull forward onto the 3rd track, where they could wait without obstructing cars on the through services before continuing off to the left and rejoining. Short section of single track on the narrow section through Barbadinhos. Looking the other direction. Madre de Dios, where the long circular service round the north joined. And then we carry on to Zabregas, which was a port industrial section again. These are old port warehouses on the right. Service 27 had joined at Madre de Dios. Nice bridge over. And this is the terminus at Porto Obispo, which I assume is the drinking fountain here. And at the same point, a tram in front of the very fine building, which I think was a wine merchant's warehouse. Early 20th century buildings and very fine architecture. Right, we now move back west of the city centre to Alcântara, which in 1974 was a turning circle here with 2 of the unrebuilt Brill cars. Originally, trams had continued through to rejoin the coastal section, but that had been withdrawn. 1983, the terminus was cut back a short distance to this sub-terminus where the trams reversed. This was what I call the inland route paralleling the coastal route with a trailer set. And here we have one of the few locations where trams pass over each other. This is the view looking down from that bridge. So we're going to pass through Praça do Comércio. You can see the complex track layout there had been in the area, with trams passing in both directions on a variety of routes. We're now moving up northwards, passing through Praça da Figueira. Martedì, the old town on the hill in the background. Continue up the main road, Avenida Almirante Reis, and now on the line up to Arco de Cega, following the 19. This is a 17 car that was running to depot, but the 19, the Route 19 and the Route 3 actually terminated within the depot compound here at Arco de Sega depot. Now have a look at the ascensores, which are the funicular tramways. 3 of them, the Lavra, the Gloria, and the Bica. Lavra and Gloria are genuine tramways. As such, the Bica is a more traditional funicular, but we will hear more about this as we come to them. So both the Lavra and the Gloria had 2 cars. The cars are motored as tram cars, and the interesting thing is that the multiple overhead wires are there because the 2 trams are wired in series. So effectively they are electrically a single tram, which when one is at the top and one at the bottom is several hundred meters long, the longest trams in the world. The downhill car is the one that drives the set. On both of them, the lower section is interlaced and the upper section is split into 2 tracks, as you can see here. This section is only used by the trams, whereas the lower section also is open to limited road traffic. And that's because there are houses built on either side of the road, as you can see here. So this was a visit in 1986 when the Lavra was under complete overhaul. The cars were in the works, and you can see work being done on the track. And with the gradient, this was obviously quite an interesting job to be done. The gentleman here is a very well-known British tramway enthusiast, Geoffrey Claydon. And you can see here the situation that has to occur from time to time. And trams are parked alongside each other halfway up the line so that a delivery van can be brought up to allow goods to be brought into the houses alongside the road. I have no idea how they managed to get this sorted out, but obviously it gets done. Just looking down the Gloria, so very similar to the Lavra. The side-on view of one of the cars, and you can see it's got a more or less typical tram underframe, except that it's bent to match the slope of the tram. So it's a fairly traditional looking tram with a level floor on a wedge-shaped truck. We now move to the Bica, and the Bica is driven by an external motor and is a much more conventional funicular. Once again, though, it is running in a street which has houses with their front doors onto the street. So there has to be access for motor vehicles as well from time to time. The Bica cars are much smaller than the Lavra and Gloria cars and use a more traditional funicular stepped format. The overhead wires are used for signalling purposes and lighting on the trams, and not for traction. We're now going to have a look generally at the 4-wheel 2-axle cars. The standard cars that you will see with the domed roof bodies were all built between 1928 and 1940. The box-like cars, so-called modern cars, were built over the period 1947 to 1964. Both types of cars include single and double-ended cars, and also cars with the more powerful motors, which were designated as hill cars, something which we will move on to later. This shows the route in the slightly darker tones that were normally operated by four-wheel cars. The longest route goes out to Ajuda on the west, and at that time came into Praça do Comércio. That route is still running, but terminates here at Caixa de Sodré. The network in the central area is quite complex, and we'll come to that later. We'll start by going around the long peripheral route. The 24 comes up from Alfândega to Madre de Deus, the 27 coming down from Poço de Bispo, and they then run together through to Campolide, where the 27 terminated, and the 24 came down this way and terminated at Carmo. Over this section, there's also the service 20, and for the purposes of this, we shall follow that down to Caixa de Sodré, its terminus, rather than go down to Carmo. So, as I say, we're starting now at Madre de Deus, and we'll go round this circuit. And here's a 24 joining the coast route at Madre de Deus. This was the 27 terminus at Campolide, where they turned in quite a large loop and had a layover point on the section which was not covered by the service 24 trams. The service 24 comes up here and goes off to the left, or comes down here and goes down to the right when it's going down towards Carmo. You'll see that the 27 is being operated by single-ended cars here. This is the 24 route, but we have other routes following the same route. We're now at the junction at Amoreiras, and in the background is the grand arch of the aqueduct of the Aguas Libres, which you can see here again, built in 1748 as the main water supply for the city. And this is the first time we've come across one of the typical Lisbon interlaced track installations, the typical layout with one freight rail and one curving rail, rather than having the rails parallel at any stage of the interlace. We're now moving south down towards Carmo. Lago Dorato was a major interchange point, complete with a siding for short workings on some of the circular services, which I will be describing after this particular section. This was the turn off to Carmo itself, and this is a car on the 20 on the left. And here we have a car on the 20 crossing over the bridge that we saw earlier with the trams underneath. We now moved out to the Ajuda terminus at the Ajuda Cemetery. It's in 1974 when the terminus ran in a clockwise direction. With the modernization of the system, the direction of the loop was changed, and here we have one of the remodelado cars based on the traditional car, but effectively a completely new modern car with a completely modern underframe, modern electronic controls, and now fitted with a pantograph as well as a trolley pole. And cars of this type now carry out the majority of the operation on the remaining tram routes. We're now moving down the Ajuda route, the 18. Despite the steep hills, these routes were all operated by the lower horsepower cars. There's another of the interlaced locations. And at the time, about half the service terminated here at Boa, and again there was a 3-track layout, so the terminating cars could run onto the 3rd track and then come across to pick up service back into town. Here's one of the works cars, some of which were original Brill cars from the beginning of the electric tramways. This one is a water car, number 389, and used from an early stage for advertising purposes. Is approaching Santo Amaro. We're now back at Santos with a variety of trams in 1995. 2001, and this was then the terminus of the Route 18. The original 24 terminus turning circle came from the right and worked round, but they changed the direction when they ran the 18 and at this stage also the 25 round here. Here again we have 2 cars of the Remodelado series. So now we come to the circular services, 22, 23, 25, 26, 29 and 30. And previous also 31 and 32, although they'd been withdrawn by 1975. Now we're going to do these all together. So you can see the complexity of the route, and we're going to start with the route, a bit of the Route 20, which used this little section, which is not covered by the other circular routes. We'll carry on the 20 to Gomes Freire, and then beyond on the circular routes down to Martimonis, and we'll then hop across to the Salbento area, and finally work up the 25 route towards Estrela. Now here we are again, as I said, at Largo de Rato, with trams on the 22 and the 26 circulars. This is the separate section of the Route 20 that I mentioned to you. I'm coming along the Route 20, although here we have a 25, and I'm not sure why a 27. But This was the original terminus at Gomes Frere, which was again a simple crossover, which did result in hold-ups to traffic on the circular services. So the 22 is having to wait while the 20 makes its reversing movement. By 1986, a turning loop had been put in around the local streets, which not only removed the conflict, but also allowed single-ended cars to be operated. And moving on towards Martedì, where we are just arriving in this shot. Figueras, the 25 crossing through and the bogey car coming through on the main route. São Bento, where we are passing the Parliament building with its fine pair of lions outside at the bottom of the steps. Now we've come back to Santos, where we can see a car carrying on one of the other curves, this time on the Route 30. You can see the siding here that, as I said, I'm not sure what its purpose was for. We're now making our way up the Route 25. Note that some of these sections are quite steep, but the lower powered cars are still used on them. This is Estrela. And we're going now, the final section are the hill routes, for which trams with more horsepower, 45 horsepower motors were built. In 1975, these were the 28, which ran from Prazeres through the city centre and up to Graça, and the shuttle service from Martedì up to São Tomé, and these had steep sections in these particular locations, which the less powerful trams would not use. So we're going to start at Prazeres. We're going to work through to this location, have a quick look at the 12, and then we're going to come back this way round through Graça and back to this area to finish off. This is the terminus, the later terminus at Prazeres, rebuilt with a turning circle. And here you can see how the cars with the more powerful motors were labelled with a white patch on the underframe. You can also see that this is a car which has had more modern platform doors put on at some stage. Back to 1974, this was the original terminus, which was a stub terminus. Now coming back towards Estrela on the 28th. Estrela was a timing point for some of the circular services. And it was also the terminus of about half the journeys, which ran from Estrela through to Graça, whereas most of the journeys from Pajeres ended up in Rueda Concepción. This is the Parliament building on the left again. So you saw this location before, and this is the 28 route crossing. Sometimes one is lucky enough to get a bedroom in a hotel which has a view of the trams. So we're continuing down towards the city centre. Another of the interlaced sections. And this is probably the worst bit, where they have to slow down for the sharp bends and then power again up the steep hill. This is the terminal point for most of the Pajeres journeys, at the bottom of the hill on a crossover in Rueda Concepción. Not easy to get sunlit pictures. There was just a short period in the morning looking in this direction, and a relatively short period again in the afternoon looking in the other direction. Again, on Rueda Concepción, this is when the Grassa Circle routes were still operating, and you'll see that because of the narrow streets, the tram has to come across onto the wrong track to make its right turn. That situation has changed these days. The number 12 still comes down there, but the curve has been realigned on a wider sweep, so it crosses to the far side, or the near side of the street where I am standing, before rejoining the other track. Passing the cathedral and running up towards Grassa. In the other direction. We now come to Sao Tome, with a very interesting little track layout here. First of all, car number 511 was at this stage one of the few remaining pre-standard cars still with a clerestory roof to remain in service. One or two of its sister vehicles had been converted to run the tourist tram and were painted in a red livery. On the left, you can see a tram at the terminus of the Sao Tome terminus of Route 12, and this section of track was not in regular passenger service. And one reason for that is you can see that the geometry of the point work here meant that the tram was having to tip rather precariously when it came through. The junction has since been remodeled because the Route 12 now runs as a circular service and does run through here and joins the 28 route. So we're now going to go down the service 12 route. Sorry, a couple of other shots just at this location, including this one where a tram broke down right on this very steep section, and it took several minutes before the towing tram was able to pull it up the gradient, and meanwhile the service was continuing to form up, waiting to get through. So here we are just leaving the Sao Tome terminus, and the interesting thing about this location is that because of the curves of the track, both in a vertical and a horizontal direction, the tram at one point does not have all its wheels on the rails. If you are on the tram, there is a notable tip over when it tips over from the rear axle to the front axle. And again, at the same point. And you get a good idea of just how steep the route was, or is still. It's now, of course, single track rather than double track because it's only operated in one direction. This is the terminus down at Martedì, and a view taken down at ground level with some old buildings in the background. And from Martedì, the current service 28 now comes up this way towards Grassa. This was the old terminus at Grassa, where the 28 cars just used the crossover to reverse, and the service beyond here was part of the Grassa Circle, the routes 10 and 11. One of the main reasons for changing the terminus is that the 28 can be operated with single-ended cars, which obviously was not possible at that time. From Grassa, we come down the Volksdorf Aéreo and into Calle de San Vicente. And this shows why the trams have survived in this area through the narrow streets. Bus operation would be totally impractical, as would operation by more modern trams. Back in 1974, this single track section was still controlled by these signalmen, one here and one just tucked around the back of the building, who spent all day flipping their tennis rackets or ping pong bats round to show no entry or green for go. The interesting thing is they seem, in all cases, to be seated outside a small wine dispensing establishment. One wonders how much their concentration varied by the end of their shift. If you recall the picture that I showed of a remodelado car, they still have a trolley pole as well as a pantograph. And one of the reasons for that is that it was felt potentially dangerous to have the wide pan collector of the pantograph here, where it's quite close to people's windows and, of course, their washing lines. So the trolley pole is still used over the very narrow sections. Escolas Gerais, again, a little bit of interlaced track, as we'll see on the next shot. And here's the tram going the other way round the curve up towards Grassa. And as it exits from view, that is a suitable point to finish this photographic compilation. It's just time to explain the current system as far as I can make out. You have the Route 15 from Algés, which runs in along here as far as Figueras and is run by the articulated cars. The 18, which now runs from Ajuda only as far as Cais de Sodre. The 25, which also terminates at Figueras and runs this way through Santos and up to Prazeres. For long, and the 28 back from Prazeres, running through Grassa and round to Martedì. The 12 now runs as a unidirectional circle, always running clockwise around this loop. The Service 24 was withdrawn for many years and was only reinstated subsequently, and runs from Campolide only down as far as Camoish, rather than going down the branch to Carmo. There has been talk about extending it through to Cache de Sodre, but I'm not sure what the current situation with that is. There are also plans, I understand, to extend back from Algés to Cruz Quebrada, and also to extend out east again to Pozo de Bispo and beyond. I hope that information is correct. I don't guarantee it. But there we are. That is the end of my presentation. I hope you've enjoyed the picture. I hope they haven't rushed through too quickly. As I say, I think some of them have somehow cut the time that I thought I'd allocated to them. It would have been difficult to have sort of stopped part way through, but there we are.